Your Listen Local station, right here on the northern beaches of Sydney. You can find us on your radio dial at 88.7 and 90.3 FM. Can't get to a radio? No worries. You can always stream our program live from anywhere in the world at rnb.org.au. And for listening on your own schedule, our podcasts are available globally at rnbpodcast.com.au. So be sure to follow and subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. Now, here is our latest podcast.
Welcome again, listeners to Community Radio Northern Beaches, 88.7 and 90.3 FM, streaming live, www.rnb.org.au. I'm Michael Lester. Our program's Community Voices, and if you'd like to check out some of our back programs and in-depth conversations with a lot of interesting people with a lot of interesting and informed things to say, you can look us up. My program's Michael Lester Mixcloud. That should get you there. And also we podcast Radio Northern Beaches podcasts if you just Google that. In the wake of the landslide election of the Albanese government, it has prompted a lot of questions in people's minds about the agenda that he might be pursuing, and speculation about the extent to which this landslide majority win, quite historic in the lower house, might enable him to pursue some substantial reforms, real reforms that this country is long in need of. I'm pleased to welcome to the program Richard Dennis, who's an economist, an author, public commentator, and particularly the executive director of the think tank Australia Institute. And he's recently published a book, Dead Centre, How Political Pragmatism is Killing Us. Welcome to the program, Richard.
Thanks for having me.
Richard, at the centre of your critique of current politics, if I can make that pun, is centrism, which you described as centrism shifts serious debate about what kind of a country we want to be and how we might get there. And even more stingingly, you characterize it as centrism means never having to pick a side, never making a powerful enemy, and never losing big fights, and inevitably never even winning them. This is a pretty strong critique. How do you see the current system actually operating around a centre?
Look, great question, and unfortunately it took me a whole essay to answer it, but let me start at the beginning. The reason we invented democracy was to resolve conflict peacefully. There's always been conflict in human societies, and once upon a time swords and guns played a bigger role than votes. So the whole idea of democracy is that people don't all agree. We don't all want the same things, or even if we want the same things, we might not agree on the best way to get them. So instead of having physical fights about them, we should have democratic fights about them. Rather than my army being bigger than yours, the idea of my voter base being bigger than yours, or more people want my ideas than yours, I think served civilization very, very well. To be clear, I'm a big fan of peaceful democracy, and I'm a big fan of people talking about things and compromising where they can. But where I think Australian democracy has gone wrong is we've confused the need to debate and the need to compromise with the pursuit of the centre. And the idea that if we can come up with a good enough idea, everyone will be happy and then we can move on. But if we can't make everyone happy, often, not always, but often we're told, well, we just can't get on and solve the problem. So, we're not allowed to tackle climate change until we've found a way to make the fossil fuel industry happy. We're not allowed to tackle gambling addiction and gambling advertising until we've found a way to make the gambling industry happy. And the idea that this is centrist, the idea that we should give a veto over what we as a nation want to do, rather than to the powerful groups, rather than give them a veto, I think if most Australians want it and the majority of parliamentarians want it, I think good policy, good politics, good democracy suggests we can crack on and do things, even when some powerful groups feel sad. But yes, as you read out, I think increasingly centrism is used to avoid big fights rather than to have them.
There might be a reflection of some of your concerns in this area to think that there has been a significant trend to a significant loss of public trust in our political system, and particularly in our two-party system, as we've seen from the elections. Notwithstanding the landslide, the primary votes of the two parties have basically fallen to the lowest levels ever. The Libs have been basically wiped out almost historically, and yet we've seen the rise of independents, which seem to suggest a dissatisfaction in the way the political system is operating at the moment among the electorate. Is that how you read the rise of these independents and crossbenchers and the fall in primary votes? A dissatisfaction, a lack of trust?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. I think, again, one of the problems with this sort of centrism, one of the problems with the way that we use, what the Labor Party think today and what the Liberal Party think today as the kind of outer bounds of what the media will talk about or what it's considered pragmatic or reasonable to talk about. I think what's happened is that the major parties have clubbed together, conspired, if you will, and said, well, if neither of them want to talk about gambling, if neither of them want to talk about fossil fuel subsidies, if neither of them want to talk about the fact that Australia gives half of the gas we export away for free, for many years now, if neither major party will admit that some problems exist, then the media wouldn't report them. And, people like you and I didn't get many chances to talk about them. And I think what's gone wrong for the major parties is that while they got very good at controlling the list of things that we were allowed to talk about, what's happened is that while they successfully kept issues like gambling reform or free gas off the political agenda, independents and minor parties have come along and said, well, the major parties might not want to talk about corruption, or the major parties might not want to talk about gambling, but I'm happy to talk about it. So I think what's happening in the electorate is that as the major parties continue to stifle debate about issues that people care about, unsurprisingly, new parties and independents are popping up and saying, well, if they won't talk about it, I will. So I think it's an exciting time for democracy. And I think that there's two options. Either the major parties get better at listening, which would be good, or there'll be more and more independents and minor parties who are willing to listen, which would be good, because that's actually what democracy requires, having a House of Representatives full of people who actually represent the people in their electorates.
In this concept of dead centre, trying to understand how it might be operationalised in a sense in the day-to-day way that our politics operates, one of the devices that you speak about are bluff bills. What are bluff bills and how do they fit this scenario of the sort of politics that we've got with the two parties?
I wasn't sure whether to include bluff bills in the piece. I thought it might be a bit inside baseball, but I probably had the most positive feedback about this idea than anything else. So I'll just quickly tell the anecdote that I tell in the essay. I used to work in Parliament. I was the Chief of Staff to the former leader of the Australian Democrats, Senator Natasha Stott-Despoja. And at the time, the Democrats were in balance of power. What does balance of power mean? It means that in the Senate, to get a majority, if neither party has enough votes to get a majority in their own right, which is the norm in the Senate, they've usually got to talk a minor party or independents into it. So when I worked for the Democrats, they were those swing votes. And when I was working for them, John Howard was Prime Minister. And the story I tell in the essay is one night a Howard government minister had a good chat with me and showed me a piece of legislation that his department had drafted, and he pulled the legislation out and he said, now, this bill's not public yet. We'll start to circulate it soon. The Democrats are never going to vote for this bill. You're gonna hate it. But a clever man like you might introduce a range of amendments. And he literally handed me some amendments to his own piece of legislation. Now, most people won't kind of be able to picture this, but what it means is that the minister who drafted a law that he was going to ask the Parliament to pass had simultaneously drafted changes to that law that he wanted another party to push for. And why did he want that? Well, because on the one hand, he knew that the law he drafted was going to probably cause some political problems for him and his party. But he didn't want to. He didn't want to disappoint some of his constituents who he'd told he wanted to, make a particular change about. So rather than come clean, he was proposing to introduce a piece of legislation that he hoped wouldn't pass, provide amendments to another party saying, why don't you push for changes? And then, of course, the consequence of that would have been a nice, months-long public debate about an issue that he wanted on the front page of the papers. So I think it's hard for people to realise how much effort goes into stitching up what looks like political conflict. And, like wrestling in America, there's some skill involved, but there's a lot of play acting as well.
So it seems like this is a device, by your telling, by which politicians, I think you call it the secret weapon of Australian politics, that you can create the illusion that you're wanting to make change, but that you're hindered all around you and that you can't do it. But at the end of the day, it's not going to happen. And perhaps you knew that to start with. Look at the other end in terms of how politics is played. And we're hearing it at the moment in terms of what's on the agenda for change and options. We hear talk about respecting the mandate from the election. Now, how real a commitment is this? And can that be, and is that used as an excuse for not confronting, let's say, bigger issues and challenges of reform?
Yeah, of course it is. And, people often hark back to the Hawke-Keating era as, an era where big reforms got made. And it's true, some major reforms passed there. And to give you an example, we floated the dollar in 1983. That was a big change at the time. So once upon a time, the government used to set the Australian exchange rate. Now, most people don't even think about it, but the exchange rate's now just set by the foreign exchange market. That was a huge change to the economy. It didn't get put to the election. There was no economic modelling. It was barely discussed. They just announced one day they were going to do it. Similarly, John Howard, decided to ban automatic weapons after the Port Arthur massacre. So the idea that you can't make a big change unless you've gone to an election and promised to do it is not just, I think, wrong, because historically that's not how we've done things, but it's dangerous. Because what we're doing in a democracy is we're electing people to represent us and make decisions on our behalf for the next 3 years. Now, no one can anticipate everything that's going to happen in the next 3 years when they're running for office. So to sort of suggest that all a government can do is the things it promised to do during an election campaign is, I think, dangerous. But let's be clear, it's actually a very conservative way of viewing government. So if you wanted to keep things the way they are, if you wanted to maintain the status quo, if you wanted to continue to subsidise fossil fuels, continue to give gas away for free, continue to let the gambling industry advertise to kids, then creating a kind of cultural expectation that governments aren't allowed to do something unless every 3 years they seek specific permission. Yeah, if you wanted to keep things the same, you'd be a big fan of that approach to mandates. But to be clear, there's no mention of mandate in the Constitution, and historically that's not how democracy's worked in Australia or indeed anywhere else in the world.
Yeah, and as you point out, many significant, transformative even decisions have been taken by governments of both colours over many decades that had no mandate at all or prior discussion. Only got to think most recently about Morrison and our commitments to AUKUS.
Absolutely. Now, to be fair to Scott Morrison, he did say that in the lead up to an election, but he was already making commitments to other countries before it went to the election. So yeah, it's just wrong. I mean, imagine if someone was running a company and when they got the job, they got a 3-year contract as CEO, they told their board, here's my strategic plan, here are the things I'm going to do, and no matter what else happens in the world, I promise I won't do anything that I haven't listed here. And if you want me to do something new, we'll have to wait till it's time to renew my 3-year contract. I mean, it's just not how the world works. But again, who benefits from this? Why would we be telling ourselves this? Well, the people who fear change, the fossil fuel industry that wants to keep its subsidy, the gambling industry that wants to keep their ads running, it's in their interest to convince us that, elected governments can't introduce good popular laws whenever they can get the numbers in Parliament to pass them.
Guest here on Community Voices Radio Northern Beach is Richard Dennis, Executive Director of the Australian Institute. We're talking about his recent book, Dead Centre, about Australian politics, and particularly the argument he's making that the pragmatism and the search for the centre in politics is killing us, in his words, but stifling open debate about a range of issues that we need to tackle, and more importantly, the full range of options that we might use to tackle them. At the root of trying to understand what's going on here, you talk about the sort of maps that we have, I guess, in our minds and conceptually and elsewhere about how a political system works and how change works. And you have a discussion about the idea that politics is about left and right and centre somewhere in the middle. But you argue that this left-right dichotomy that we use in our head to talk about politics is now totally inadequate to the electoral situation that we see, which has almost gone three ways rather than even just two.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And to be clear, I'm not saying in the essay that left has no meaning and right has no meaning. What I'm saying in the essay is that over time, the number of new issues that have arrived, the number of problems we have to solve that don't fit neatly into the left-right framework, has just grown so rapidly that hanging on to the left-right framework makes less and less sense. For example, in Australian political history, the Labor Party was formed by the union movement to protect workers' rights, and what we think of as the Liberal Party today was really the merger of lots of parties who were kind of united by the idea that the Labor Party were too powerful and too successful. So literally our major political parties were formed to have a particular fight about industrial relations. And in that context, left and right, means a lot. But how is the idea that wanting to subsidise native forest logging is a right-wing issue? Right-wingers once upon a time didn't like subsidies. And right-wingers once upon a time, conservatives, were the founders of things like the conservation movement. There's a hint in the name, conservation, conservatives. And indeed, it was a former Liberal Attorney General, Garfield Barwick, who formed the Australian Conservation Foundation. But these days, we know that wanting to save trees is something lefties do, and wanting to chop trees down is something that right-wingers want to do. Well, that doesn't make any philosophical sense. It doesn't make any historical sense. And when we look around the world, we just don't see that those issues are seen through the prism of left and right. Or perhaps more radically, John Howard in 2007 went to the 2007 election proposing a carbon price. Now, Kevin Rudd was also proposing a carbon price in 2007. So in 2007, a carbon price was arguably bipartisan and centrist. Whereas if I came out today and said, why don't we have a carbon price, apparently that would be radical and extreme and left wing. So yeah, it's okay for us to have differences of opinion about our values and our preferred policies, but trying to stuff everything into two boxes called left and right, and then sort of trying to find the middle ground between those two arbitrary boxes just makes less and less sense when we're trying to figure out solutions to problems like online privacy, artificial intelligence, climate change, work from home. The idea of left and right just doesn't do a very good job of capturing any deep philosophical or policy consistency when trying to solve them.
And yet we're all stuck maybe, and this is your argument, maybe with a conceptual map or a conceptual framework that sees things in those terms very much and interprets and commentates, including in the media and on elections. We've got these ideas which are now patently out of date, if you like. When you look at concepts from that era of the pendulum and safe seats, reflecting this sort of division of left and right and two parties, I mean, that's gone out the window, hasn't it, in the face of complexity of modern important issues that need to be tackled?
Absolutely. So I guess there's two separate but related points here. One is that, the idea that each policy issue can be seen as left and right, which I just talked about. And then there's the kind of elections that we have and the electoral consequences where we think of a pendulum swinging, smoothly from left to right. And we've been trained to think about this pendulum that just swings in two dimensions, left, right. And that means between Labor and between Liberals. That pendulum metaphor gives us the idea that there's marginal seats that get easily toppled by the pendulum, and then there's safe seats that are a long way from where the pendulum can knock them down. And just like it doesn't make a lot of sense to talk about things like online safety as a left-wing issue or a right-wing issue, it doesn't make much sense in Australia anymore to talk about safe seats and marginal seats. And, you're coming to me from the Northern Beaches. Well, there's no better place in Australia to understand how silly the idea of left, right seats and safe and marginal seats is. Because, once upon a time, not that long ago, the seat of Warringah, held by Tony Abbott, was one of the safest Liberal seats in the country. Now, obviously, Zali Steggall knocked him off in 2019. That could have been a big warning to the Liberal Party. Hey, maybe we shouldn't take voters for granted. But they ignored that warning. And then in 2022, you saw the seats of Mackellar and North Sydney, both, well, particularly Mackellar was a very safe Liberal seat, which obviously fell to Sophie Scombs. So, yeah, I think voters aren't happy about being told they're in a left-wing box or a right-wing box and that they'll always have to vote for one or other parties. I think voters are increasingly saying, don't put me in a box, I'll make up my own mind. And as you've seen up there, increasingly, voters around Australia are willing to vote for independence, and it's really shaken up not just Parliament but the way we view our political system.
Well, indeed. I mean, it's still interpreted, isn't it, by analysts and commentators very much with this left-right idea and obscuring perhaps some of the realities of how the electorate feels about the way parties are operating in their centre-seeking ground. They're still always transferring the votes into two-party preferred, hiding the fact, perhaps, in those numbers, and look at the landslide victory of a system where, as I say, the primary votes of both parties have basically collapsed to be filled by independents and cross benches. But it does raise the question which you raise about who defines and how this centrist ground. And you also suggest that this centre ground idea is created to avoid change, and it's actually weaponized by those who don't want more radical and transformative policies. So who defines this ground and how?
Oh, good question. I mean, that's, how does democracy really work? I don't know if I've got a short answer to that. But look, there's no doubt that the major political parties, what we call the mainstream media or the legacy media, have played a big role in explaining to Australians how their democracy works. And more than one thing's happening at the same time here, but I think that just as fewer and fewer people are subscribing to newspapers and fewer people are watching the free-to-air news each night, it's no accident that more and more people are making their own minds up about whether they might feel like voting for an independent or a minor party. So I think that the major parties and the media had done a pretty good job of convincing everyone that there's safe seats and there's marginal seats and there's a left wing and there's a right wing, and that's just the way it is, and elections are a bit boring and there's not much to talk about. And if you live in a safe seat, well, sucks to be you, your vote doesn't really count. Well, I think we've seen in the last 6 years how rapidly that's changed. And the fact that there's no such thing as a safe seat now, the fact that, at this election, Labor saw seats like Bean here in the ACT or Fremantle over in WA swing from, double-digit safe seat to less than 0.5% marginal seat. They nearly lost both of those seats to high-profile independents. I think it's pretty obvious to the major parties they better start behaving differently, or they're not just going to lose more primary votes, they're going to lose more seats.
Well, you do define at some
Michael, I will have to go in a minute. Sorry to interrupt there.
Okay, well, I'll take it for as long as I can. Just stop when you're finished. Yeah, you do define centrism as a willingness to let others define the breadth of what's politically acceptable and what defines radicalism and extremism that's not acceptable. And you do even speculate that perhaps, quote unquote, power is behind this, the exercise of power. I'm not sure by whom. And that you ask the question, if the power changes, does that make the centre shift ground? Does it? And does the centre shift?
Look, I think power plays a big and important but hard to see role in our democracy, in part because our media don't like to talk about power that much. I mentioned the gas industry before. Australia is one of the world's largest exporters of liquefied natural gas. That's a very profitable industry. It only employs around 18,000 people. It's 25 million people in Australia. It only employs 18,000 people. But because we give more than half the gas that we export away for free, literally for free, gas industry is very, very profitable in Australia. So it doesn't employ a lot of people, but it's very, very, very profitable. And they use those profits to make powerful friends and influence powerful people and make sure that people really keep their interests front and centre in their minds. So, yeah, I think in Australia we struggle to talk a bit about how some corporations wield power, how some churches wield power, indeed how some, football clubs or codes can wield power. Power is real in a democracy, but in Australia it's impolite to talk about it. Where I think this intersects with all this is that the more independents there are, the more minor parties there are, the easier it is for different voices to be heard in our debate, not for powerful groups to dominate the major party's voice.
As we wrap up here on Radio Northern Beaches Community Voices with our guest Richard Dennis, Executive Director of Australia Institute, about his current essay, Dead Centre of Australian Politics. You wind up your essay by speculating about the opportunity to rethink Australian politics and to forge a new path. What's the way through this, do you think?
I think the way through this is firstly to kind of not be scared of it. There's so much effort goes into telling people that minority government is chaos and that independents are chaos and, that it's dangerous. But, of course, you're coming to me from Sydney. New South Wales is in minority government right now. The Labor government doesn't have a majority in either house. And it's fine. And I'm talking to you from Canberra, and the ACT's been in a so-called minority or power sharing government for nearly 20 years, and it's fine. So I think step one is to not be scared. Step two is to have high expectations. I say in the book, democracy thrives on high expectations. And when we become cynical, when we become disengaged, when we say, oh, they're all the same, they're all a bit hopeless, we're actually giving them power. We're saying, all right, well, I'll just leave you guys to keep making a mess of it. I would encourage people to think hard about what kind of country they want to live in. Australia is one of the richest countries in the world. There's nothing that any country can afford to do that we can't afford to do, but we choose at the moment to be one of the lowest tax countries. And those big choices like giving our gas away for free or subsidising fossil fuels or spending $300 billion on AUKUS submarines, it's those choices that make us poor, and we could change them just by changing our vote.
Thank you, Richard Dennis and the Australia Institute, for joining us in your busy schedule here on Community Voices Radio Northern Beaches. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you so much, Michael.
The second coming. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming? Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born.
Australia, the lucky country. We've got meat pies. We've got the world's best beer. But most importantly, top of the list, we've got Radio Northern Beaches 88.7, 90.3. Now hitting the entire world on www.rmb.org.au.